In the winter of 1942, aboard the British convoy escort vessel HMS Calderpoint, life in the cramped galley was ruled by routine boiling kettles, the metallic rattle of ration tins, and the constant vibration of engines pushing the ship through U-boat-infested waters. Yet behind this ordinary setting, the ship's cook, Arthur Hale, had begun experimenting with an idea born from a growing fear shared by many sailors: the increasing failure rate of the convoy's emergency signaling gear. Long nights under blackout conditions meant that if the ship were attacked or separated from the formation, even a few minutes without a working flare or lamp could prove fatal. Hale, a former railway mechanic before the war, believed he could build a backup system using nothing more than spare metal, simple chemical compounds used for heating rations, and parts scavenged from damaged kitchen tools. It started as a quiet attempt to keep his crew safer, but soon his odd tinkering in the galley would catch the attention of officers who never imagined that a practical wartime innovation might emerge from a ship's kitchen. Hale's interest in emergency signaling had intensified after an incident 2 months earlier, when the Calderpoint narrowly escaped a torpedo that struck a vessel just ahead in the convoy. Amid the confusion, several ships attempted to signal one another, but a combination of salt-corroded wiring and storm damage rendered half the lamps unusable. The event left the crew shaken, and Hale in particular felt the weight of helplessness as he watched men fighting to keep their bearings in the chaos. He knew that ships in blackout mode relied heavily on coordinated signals, and without them, even well-trained escorts could slip into disarray. Drawing on his pre-war experience with steam-powered tools, Hale began experimenting in secret during the quieter night watches. At first, he tested small prototypes in the far corner of the galley, using the heat from the stove and small containers originally meant for boiling tea water. What he envisioned was a device that could create a bright, visible plume without electricity, something powered purely by heat and pressure, resources always available on a working ship. He tested mixtures of safe, commonly available compounds used to heat field rations, observing how different amounts produced varying intensities of steam and color. The cook kept everything carefully documented in a small notebook wedged between sacks of flour, hoping that one day the notes might lead to something reliable. His initial attempts were far from successful. The first metal container he attempted to reinforce buckled under pressure, leaving scorch marks on the galley wall and earning him a stern lecture from the chief engineer. But Hale refused to give up. He scavenged stronger materials, leftover steel sheets from a damaged ventilation panel, a discarded pressure valve from an old kettle, and a set of narrow copper tubes that a stoker was about to throw overboard. Slowly, the pieces began to come together. The breakthrough occurred when he discovered that a trace amount of magnesium, the same material used in some Allied signal flares, could be integrated safely into the mixture when sealed inside a reinforced chamber. The combustion remained controlled, producing a bright white plume without explosive force. This vapor rose higher and lasted longer than any steam plume he had produced before. He tested the prototype behind the ship's mess hall, shielding it from view to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. The plume cut sharply through the night air, visible even against the dim glow of the convoy scattered across the horizon. The following morning, a few crewmen noticed the residue on the deck and asked Hale what he had been up to. He brushed them off, insisting it was merely a cooking experiment gone wrong. But rumors spread quickly on a wartime ship, and before long, several sailors had begun stopping by during meal hours, offering scrap materials or volunteering to help test his next idea. Though none fully understood what Hale was building, they sensed that it might one day make the difference between life and loss in the unforgiving Atlantic. By late January, Hale had assembled a fully functional prototype, a compact thermally activated signaling device, sturdy enough to withstand rough seas. He stored it in a wooden crate beneath the galley shelves, unsure how or when he might convince the officers to take it seriously. Yet fate, as it often did during wartime, would force the matter sooner than he expected. The opportunity, and the danger, came on a night the crew would remember for the rest of the war. It was February 1942, and the Calderpoint was escorting a slow-moving merchant convoy through a stretch of the North Atlantic, known grimly as Torpedo Alley. A gale had been raging since dusk. Sheets of freezing rain hammered the deck. Radar returns flickered with interference, and visibility narrowed to a few dozen meters. Convoy discipline was already strained. Ships drifted too close or too far apart, unable to keep formation under the violent heaving of the sea. Just after midnight, the first sign of trouble arrived as a faint, muffled thud. So soft the crew initially mistook it for shifting cargo below deck. But within seconds, the realization set in. A vessel somewhere behind them had been hit. The Calderpoint's alarm bell rang. Boots pounded across wet metal flooring, and the ship veered sharply off its intended course to investigate. The blackout protocols were rigidly enforced. No lights were allowed above deck, not even a lantern. Every man moved by memory or shouted instructions, all while lightning briefly illuminated the chaos around them. The convoy commander attempted to coordinate signals, but the relentless salt spray had already corroded several of the Calderpoint's electrical lamp housings. When the signal officer attempted to flash a message to a nearby merchant ship, the lamp fizzed, sparked, and died entirely. Backup units failed to engage. The ship was essentially mute in the darkness, unable to warn the surrounding vessels or confirm the nature of the attack. In the middle of this confusion, Arthur Hale had rushed topside, still wearing his stained apron, carrying the wooden crate that held his prototype. Rain soaked him instantly, and icy water pooled around the deck with every rock of the ship. Men shouted at him to get below before he slipped overboard, but Hale pressed on, weaving between crew members, securing cables, and hauling equipment. He found the first officer near the starboard rail and shouted over the storm that he had a way to signal the convoy. The officer, desperate for any solution, hesitated only a moment before nodding sharply and ordering space cleared near an ammunition storage crate shielded from the wind. He locked the pressure chamber into place, tightened the valve, and positioned the ignition burner beneath the metal cylinder. A small crowd gathered, unsure whether this strange contraption would save them or explode in their faces. Hale lit the burner, shielding the flame with his hands. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened but a low, steady hiss. Then the pressure began to climb. He could feel the vibration through the metal deck. The plume erupted with a force that startled even Hale. A column of bright white vapor shot straight into the air, visible even through the thick curtain of rain. The magnesium-infused steam reacted with the moisture in the atmosphere, producing a shimmering glow that held its shape far longer than any conventional flare. It rose high above the ship, bright enough that nearby escorts, merchant vessels, and even the damaged freighter behind them could orient themselves toward its position. The glow cast ghostly reflections across the waves, breaking through the darkness and revealing the silhouettes of the surrounding ships. From the bridge, the captain immediately ordered a series of maneuver signals to be executed, using the beacon as the central point around which the convoy could realign. One by one, distant vessels began adjusting their headings, tightening formation despite the storm. The U-boat commander, seeing the sudden coordinated movement, was forced to break off his pursuit, fearing a counterattack by the escorts. The crisis eased, though the storm continued its assault. The Calderpoint rescued 19 survivors from the torpedoed ship, men who later reported that the glowing plume had been the only thing they could see while drifting in the freezing black water. Without it, they said, they might never have been found. On deck, soaked to the bone and trembling from a mix of cold and adrenaline, Hale extinguished the burner and carefully collapsed the device. For a moment, the crew simply stared at him, the significance of what he had just done settling in. Then slowly at first, sailors began clapping, their cheers carried away by the wind but unmistakably heartfelt. Hale said nothing. He just nodded once, tightened the straps of the crate, and returned below deck, as though he had done nothing more extraordinary than peel potatoes. By the next morning, the storm had weakened into a frigid, uneven drizzle, leaving the convoy bruised but intact. The damage assessment teams moved between ships by rope-slung dinghies, carrying medical kits, fresh batteries, and encrypted messages. Word had already spread about the strange beacon that cut through the rain, a signal unlike anything the crews had seen before. Some believed it had been a prototype sent by the Admiralty, Others whispered that it was a new American device being tested in secrecy. Few imagined it had been built inside the cramped kitchen of an escort vessel. A formal inquiry was convened in the Calderpoint's wardroom shortly after dawn. The captain, a stern officer named Commodore Harold Whitcomb, sat at the head of the table with a mug of strong tea, his uniform still damp at the shoulders. The first officer, the chief engineer, and the convoy's communications officer flanked him. Hale stood at attention beside his crate, looking uncharacteristically tense, the steam burns on his hands still raw. Whitcomb motioned for him to begin. Hale, clearing his throat, explained the device in simple, practical terms. Its heat-based activation method, its reliance on common shipboard materials, and its independence from electrical systems that were so often compromised in heavy seas. He described how the magnesium trace reacted under pressure, producing a vapor that remained visible despite fog, rain, or blackout restrictions. The officers listened with growing interest, occasionally exchanging glances as Hale referenced familiar ration tin chemicals and damaged galley equipment repurposed into critical components. The communications officer interrupted with a rare note of admiration, admitting that the plume had been visible from 3 ships out at minimum, and that it remained stable far longer than any flare they had deployed during the war thus far. The chief engineer, initially skeptical, inspected the device closely, tapping the reinforced chamber and tracing the weld lines with his thumb. He asked Hale several technical questions about maximum safe pressure, about failure points, about heat thresholds, and Hale answered each with the precision of someone who had tested the device dozens of times. At the conclusion of the briefing, Commodore Whitcomb dismissed the group except for Hale, closing the wardroom door behind them. For a moment, the captain remained silent, weighing his words. Then he told Hale that the Admiralty had recently circulated a request for practical, low-cost innovations that could be reproduced quickly on escort vessels with limited resources. "Your beacon," he said, "may be exactly the sort of solution they're hoping for, but before the invention could be reported, it needed a field test under controlled conditions." 3 nights later, the convoy made a scheduled rendezvous with a Canadian corvette carrying a small engineering detachment. On the open sea, under a clear sky, the Calderpoint deployed the beacon a second time. The plume rose clean and bright, visible to the engineering team from well beyond expected range. They recorded readings, collected residue samples, and interviewed Hale for nearly an hour, scribbling notes furiously. The chief engineer from the corvette remarked that the device's simplicity was its greatest strength. Ships constantly lost electrical systems due to corrosion, but heat and pressure were abundantly reliable. Within a week, a coded message arrived. The Admiralty wanted a detailed report, and the convoy was instructed to escort Hale and his prototype to Scapa Flow, where naval scientists could evaluate its potential for broader use. Crewmen congratulated Hale throughout the day, offering jokes, pats on the shoulder, and even a few extra ration biscuits. But Hale remained reserved. He was proud, yes, but wary. Wartime inventions often disappeared into government trials, never to be seen or credited again. Still, as the Calderpoint altered course toward the massive anchorage of the home fleet, the ship carried with it something rare for those dangerous months: a sense of possibility. A cook, armed with nothing more than scraps, determination, and a desire to protect his fellow sailors, had built something that had already saved lives. And now, for the first time, the Royal Navy was ready to see just how far his creation could go. The journey to Scapa Flow took 4 days, each one marked by tension, expectation, and an unusual sense of unity aboard the Calderpoint. Escort ships rarely sailed alone for long, so the crew felt every mile of exposed sea as a potential threat. Yet even the constant fear of U-boats couldn't smother the quiet excitement around Hale's invention. Sailors who had barely spoken to him before now lingered in the galley, asking careful questions about pressure valves or recounting stories of failed lamps during earlier convoys. To many of them, the cook's beacon wasn't just a tool. It was a reminder that ingenuity still had a place in a war that so often felt defined by machinery far beyond the control of ordinary men. When the gray, jagged outline of the Orkney Islands appeared on the horizon, the mood shifted from anticipation to nervous formality. Scapa Flow was one of the most important naval bases in the world, a harbor ringed by fortress-like cliffs and patrolled by everything from small tenders to capital ships. Entering it felt like stepping into the center of the Royal Navy's vast machinery. The Calderpoint was guided between anchored cruisers and repair barges until it finally moored beside a floating workshop. Within an hour, a team of engineers and scientists boarded the escort vessel, carrying toolkits, notebooks, and a curious air of quiet authority. They assembled in the mess deck, transformed hastily into a technical workspace. Hale, visibly uneasy under the attention, opened the crate once more and removed the device with the same careful movements he used when handling the ship's knives. The senior engineer, a thin, sharp-eyed lieutenant commander named Roland Marks, inspected every detail while asking Hale to explain the development of the beacon from start to finish. Marks took particular interest in the reinforced chamber and the controlled magnesium infusion, remarking that the balance was remarkably stable for something built in a rolling kitchen during North Atlantic storms. The team spent 2 days conducting controlled tests near the rocky coastline. The beacon was triggered at different heat levels, exposed to salt spray, submerged partially in seawater, and tested during both daytime and nighttime conditions. It performed reliably in every trial. The plume's brightness varied slightly depending on atmospheric moisture, but the device consistently produced a clear signal that surpassed many mid-war emergency flares without requiring delicate components, batteries, or specialized chemicals. Marks's final assessment was blunt. This could be manufactured in dozens of small workshops across Britain, even under material shortage conditions. With that statement, the Admiralty formally approved further development. Hale was invited, or rather ordered, to spend 2 weeks working with technicians at the base to create a standardized blueprint suitable for naval distribution. Reluctantly leaving the Calderpoint, he packed his notebook and a few personal items, bidding farewell to the crew who lined the railings to see him off. Though he tried to hide it, the men could tell he was overwhelmed. He had enlisted expecting only to scrub pans and peel root vegetables in the freezing North Atlantic. Now he was being treated almost like an officer, or at least like someone whose work mattered far beyond the limits of a ship's galley. Life at Scapa was rigorous but focused. Hale found himself working alongside blacksmiths, chemists, and radio technicians, all contributing their expertise to refine the beacon. They adjusted the internal chamber for easier mass production, standardized the chemical mixture into pre-measured packets, and developed a more stable ignition plate that could be lit even in high winds. For the first time, the device acquired an official designation, the Thermal Elevation Signal MEC-N. Before Hale returned to the Calderpoint, the base commander presented him with a small typed commendation, recognizing his contribution to convoy safety, nothing extravagant, but more than he had ever expected. He folded it carefully and tucked it into the inner lining of his coat, certain he would never seek recognition again. By early spring, limited numbers of the MEC-1 signal were already being shipped to escort vessels operating in the Atlantic and Arctic routes. Reports filtered back to Scapa describing successful deployments during storms, mechanical failures, and even after enemy engagements where electrical systems were disabled. In several cases, the beacon had enabled rescue teams to locate lifeboats that would otherwise have been lost in darkness. Hale returned to the Calderpoint a different man, still humble, still soft-spoken, but marked by a quiet confidence. When he stepped aboard, the crew greeted him with cheers, calling him Chief Cook Inventor and the man who lights up the sea. Hale only smiled and returned to his station, where water boiled, knives clattered, and the familiar scent of barley stew filled the air. War continued, with its tragedies and victories, but aboard the Calderpoint and later many other ships, a simple device born from fear, resourcefulness, and the heat of a kitchen stove became a silent companion. It was never the kind of invention that earned medals or headlines, but it saved lives, guided ships through darkness, and stood as proof that even in the most brutal years of the Second World War, innovation could come from the humblest corner of a vessel, shaped by the hands of an ordinary man trying to protect the people around him. As 1943 unfolded, the war at sea only grew harsher. The Battle of the Atlantic reached its deadliest phase, with U-boats claiming ships at a pace that strained Allied resources. Yet in the midst of these exhausting months, the thermal elevation signal MK1 quietly spread across destroyers, corvettes, trawlers, and merchant escorts. It was never issued with ceremony. Crates of the devices simply began appearing in supply lists, tucked between boxes of spare valves and tins of condensed milk. But sailors noticed. Soon, every man who served on rough northern routes knew the strange column-shaped beacon that could be activated with nothing more than a flame and patience. The Calderpoint herself continued escort duty for months, pushing through sleet, rough seas, and relentless tension. Each time the ship rolled in a storm or the lights flickered, the presence of the device, stored neatly in a reinforced container near the galley, offered a rare sense of security. The crew trusted it, not because they admired the engineering, but because they had seen it work when nothing else had. Hale settled back into his role as cook, though his days were a little different now. Engineers occasionally came aboard to ask him about maintenance tips or the device's early development. Young stokers asked him to sign ration tins as a joke. The captain requested he keep meticulous notes in case the Admiralty required improvements. Hale complied, but privately he remained grounded in the simple truth he had never intended to invent anything. He had merely tried to solve a problem in the only way he knew how. By late 1943, convoy reports documented more than a dozen instances where the Mech 1 beacon had played a decisive role in maintaining formation or guiding rescue efforts during blackouts. In one notable case, a damaged escort in the Arctic managed to signal its position to Soviet pilots flying search routes over crushing ice floes. In another, a merchant ship drifting after an engine failure used the beacon to alert escorts and avoid a collision in heavy fog. The device was not revolutionary in the technological sense, but it filled a gap, one created not by lack of intelligence, but by wartime scarcity and the brutal conditions of the Atlantic. At the end of the year, Hale was quietly promoted to petty officer and awarded a commendation for service contributing materially to the safety of His Majesty's fleet. There was no ceremony, no public announcement. Such recognition was common in wartime. Many acts of heroism and innovation remained unpublicized due to naval secrecy. Hale accepted the promotion with characteristic modesty, then returned to peeling potatoes as though nothing had happened. The war eventually shifted. Allied shipbuilding surged. U-boats began to lose the advantage, and better radar and escort coordination transformed the seas. Yet the Merc 1 remained in use, well past 1944, largely unchanged from Hale's original concept. Even after newer technologies emerged, many captains kept a thermal beacon on board just in case, trusting the rugged simplicity of a device that had no wires to corrode and no batteries to fail. After the war, Hale returned to civilian life in Yorkshire. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his wartime contributions. When asked by neighbors what he had done during the conflict, he usually answered, "Cooked for the Navy," and left it at that. His notebooks were stored in an old tin box beneath his bed, their pages still covered with careful measurements, burn marks, and sketches of reinforced chambers. He never sought recognition, and history, busy with larger events, grander inventions, and dramatic victories, never sought him. But on ships scattered across the North Atlantic, memories of his work lingered. Veteran sailors spoke occasionally of a strange beacon invented by a cook, a device that cut through storm and darkness at a moment when survival seemed uncertain. They remembered the white plume rising through rain, steady and unwavering, guiding men who would have otherwise been lost. And in that way, Arthur Hale's legacy endured, not in textbooks or medals, but in the quiet recollections of those who had served beside him. In a war defined by destruction, his creation had stood for something different: ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the determination of ordinary people trying to protect one another in extraordinary times.